Some stories are better heard with someone else. But you're here alone. Welcome to Don't Listen Alone. This is 100% ad-free, just you and whatever comes next. Drop your location and the time before we begin. Now, listen carefully. Not everything you hear is part of the story. When I was a child, I was never the kind of person who liked thrillers or scary stories. I had no interest in ghost tales, haunted houses, or anything paranormal. Those things were not part of my world growing up. For the first 9 years of my life, I lived in a small trailer with my parents and siblings. We did not have cable, so television was never a big part of my life, and I was not much of a reader either. Because of that, I knew almost nothing about ghosts or spirits. Honestly, I did not even really know what people meant when they talked about such things. I was not the kind of kid who filled my head with frightening ideas, which is why what happened later in my life confused me so much. I did not have stories in my mind to shape my fear. I did not already believe in any of it. Whatever I experienced came into my life before I had words for it. By the time I turned 12, we had been living in our new house for about 4 years. It was a beautiful house, still fairly new, and I loved it. I was proud of it in the way children can be proud of a home, especially after living in a much smaller place before. It felt bright, safe, and much bigger than where we had come from. For a while, everything about it seemed perfect. But somewhere during those years, little things started changing for me. At first, I could not explain them. They were not big dramatic events. They were just strange feelings that began to collect around the house. It started with moments that felt small enough to ignore but strange enough to stay with me. I would be sitting at the computer, doing something completely normal, and suddenly I would feel as if someone was standing over my shoulder watching me. It was not just the usual nervous feeling that sometimes makes you turn around. It felt specific, like attention was fixed on me from very close by. Other times, I would be outside on the swing set with my sister, and I would think I heard her say something, but when I turned to answer, she had said nothing at all. It was little things like that. Nothing I could really prove, nothing dramatic enough to run and tell people about, but enough to make me feel unsettled. Over time, those little feelings became stronger. I got to the point where I was scared to sleep with my bedroom door shut. I wanted it open, as if leaving it that way somehow made me safer. At 12 years old, I did not understand what was happening to me. I did not know whether I was imagining things, whether the house was making me nervous for some reason, or whether there was really something there. I only knew that being alone in certain rooms made me uneasy. The house I loved had somehow started feeling different. It had not stopped being home, but parts of it no longer felt empty in the normal way. It felt as though something unseen had started moving around in the edges of my life. By the time I was 13, those strange feelings became something more visible. I began seeing what looked like a child sitting in the corner of my bedroom. I still remember how strange it felt the first few times. It was never a loud or dramatic sighting. It was more like I would look into that corner, and there would be the shape of a child there, small and quiet, just sitting. It was enough to frighten my friends badly. Some of them refused to stay in my room for long, and one time a friend got so upset that she went home without even staying the night. I was confused more than anything. I did not understand why this was happening, or why I was seeing something no one else could explain. My room, which should have been the place where I felt most secure, was becoming the place where the strange things gathered. I did not have a dramatic explanation for it then. I did not call him a ghost right away. I did not even know how to think about him. I just knew that something about my room was not normal anymore, and that I was not the only one who felt that. My friends reacted because they sensed something too, even if they did not always see exactly what I saw. Their fear only made me more aware that whatever was happening was not something I could quietly laugh off and forget. A few months before my 14th birthday, something happened that made everything feel more real. I was down in our basement one day watching television. Our basement was not one of those creepy basements from movies or stories. It did not usually give me bad feelings. It was not dark in some horrible way, and it was not the part of the house I feared most. It was just a basement, plain and ordinary, the kind of place you would never expect anything especially strange to happen. That made what happened there even harder to dismiss. I remember sitting there when I suddenly got a strange feeling, almost as if someone had touched my arm to get my attention. It was quick but very clear, the kind of sensation that makes you turn right away without thinking. When I looked around, I caught a glimpse of a small boy. It was not a long sighting, not enough for me to study every detail in that moment, but it was enough that I knew I had seen someone. Or something. Small, child-sized, and they're just long enough to make my heart jump. I did not tell everyone about it. In fact, I told only one person, my best friend Aloy. I trusted her, and I needed to say it out loud to someone who would not laugh at me. When I told her, she admitted that she already knew. That surprised me more than I expected. I asked her what she meant, and she told me she had seen him before too, sitting in one of the corners of my room. She had not told me at the time because she thought it was probably nothing serious, and she did not want to scare me. That confession changed everything for me. Until then, I had been living inside my own confusion, wondering whether it was just me, whether I was too sensitive, too nervous, or imagining things. Hearing that Aloy had seen him too made it feel much more real. She told me he was a young boy with blonde hair. That was the first time he really started taking shape as more than just a strange feeling or a dark shape in the corner. He became a little boy to us. A presence with an age and a look. For months after that, Aloy and I kept quiet about it. We did not go around telling everyone in dramatic voices that there was a ghost in my house. We mostly talked to each other, privately, trying to make sense of what we had both experienced. We even gave him a nickname. We started calling him Sammy. At first, Sammy did not frighten me in a truly deep way. I was startled by him, yes, and unsettled whenever I saw him, but nothing he did felt openly threatening. He was simply there, mostly in my room, the basement, or the kitchen. He became a strange part of the background of my life, like something that should not have been there and yet was. I did not know what he wanted. I did not know whether he meant anything at all beyond the fact of his presence. But because nothing truly bad had happened, I did not feel constant terror. Startled is not the same as frightened, and I knew the difference. Then came my 14th birthday, and with it one of the strangest parts of the whole story. That year I had a birthday party at my house. There must have been around 25 kids running around, laughing, talking, eating, and filling the place with energy. It should have been loud and fun and completely ordinary. Most of the party was spent in the living room, and on the surface everything seemed normal. But the whole time I had this strange feeling underneath everything else. It was one of those feelings that makes you look around even while smiling and acting like nothing is wrong. I could not shake the sense that something odd was going on around us. At one point during the party, Aloy told me that she could not find one of the girls who had come. I remember feeling reluctant to leave the living room and go looking for her because I did not want to seem like a rude host, disappearing from everyone at my own party. But eventually I got up to search around the house. When I found the girl, she was coming down the stairs, smiling broadly, looking perfectly calm and at ease. The moment I saw her, the weird feeling that had been hanging over me lifted. It was gone as suddenly as it had come. I did not understand why at the time. I just remember thinking it was odd that the uneasy feeling disappeared as soon as she rejoined the rest of us. I did not know then that she had been the one to step into something the rest of us had only glimpsed. Several months later, everything finally came together. I was at a slumber party with Aloy, the same girl from my birthday party, and another friend of ours named Ray. We were all lying around on the floor talking and sharing stories the way girls do at sleepovers when the night is long and everyone is too comfortable to sleep yet. At one point, I made a comment about my sister and said something about how I was glad I only had one brother and two sisters. It was just a casual remark. I was not trying to start any deep conversation. But the moment I said it, the girl from my birthday party looked shocked. She asked me if I had another brother. Aloy and I looked at each other right away. We told her no, that the only brother I had was a year younger than me. The girl, who I will call B, went pale almost instantly. She started asking again, more urgently. "Are you sure? You don't have a little brother?" By then, Alloy and I were already starting to understand where this was going. There was a feeling between us that the pieces were lining up in a way neither of us liked. Alloy asked B to describe the boy she meant. B told us that he looked about 7 or 8 years old. He had blonde hair, a shade darker than mine, and blue eyes that matched mine exactly. She said he wore old overalls. Hearing her describe him made my whole body go cold. This was not some random child she had seen at a crowded party and forgotten about later. She described someone who fit exactly with what Alloy and I had already been calling Sammy. At first, Ray looked completely confused because she had no idea what Alloy and I were thinking. Then B, still pale and shaken, explained what had happened at my party. She said that when she had gone upstairs to use the bathroom, she had seen the little boy sitting on the steps as she came back down. He had been sitting there watching her. She had sat down beside him and simply started talking to him as though he were any normal little brother of mine. That detail struck me hard. To B, he had not looked ghostly or distorted or strange in a dramatic way. He had looked real enough that she sat beside him and had a full conversation. She asked him how he was, and he smiled at her. She told us they talked about his dinosaur toy and how he was really happy that day. She had asked him if he was happy because it was my birthday, and he had told her yes. That hurt me in a strange way because it made him feel so much more human than he ever had before. He said that after a while she got up to go get a drink. On the way back, she passed me and then stayed in the living room with the rest of us for the rest of the party. She did not see him again. She had simply assumed that my father had put him to bed, the way any parent would with a younger child after a while. She had no reason to question it. Not until that conversation months later, when Alloy and I told her about Sammy and about the possibility that the little boy she sat and talked with was not my brother at all. When B finished telling us everything, she looked so confused that she seemed close to tears. I could not blame her. She had not just sensed something or caught a glimpse the way Alloy and I had. She had fully seen him, spoken to him, and listened to him answer. She had interacted with him as naturally as if he were alive. That changed the whole story for me. Up until then, Sammy had mostly been glimpses, feelings, and small appearances. B's experience gave him a full scene, a personality, and a voice. From that point on, I could not think of him as just an odd shape or a strange child in the corner of my room. He became a boy who could smile, answer questions, and talk about being happy. That made him both more real and, in some ways, even sadder. Because if he truly was some kind of spirit or presence tied to our house, then he was not just a random haunting. He was a child. A child who seemed attached to us, or at least to our home, and who for whatever reason had chosen to appear so clearly at my birthday party. Years have passed since then, and I still sometimes catch glimpses of him in the house. But I never again saw him as fully as B did that day. Most of the time, what I experience now is more like flashes at the edge of sight. A quick shape. A sense of movement. A feeling that he is in one of the rooms where he used to appear most often. Alloy has seen him a couple of times too, even years later, but still not with the same full clarity B described. It is almost as though whatever allowed B to see him so completely that day has never happened again. The strangest part is when he tends to appear. I normally only catch glimpses of him when I am deeply depressed, or if I call out for him. That detail has stayed with me because it makes me feel that whatever connection there is between us is emotional somehow. Maybe I am more open to seeing him when I am hurting. Maybe sadness lowers some wall in me that normally keeps things separate. Or maybe he only comes near when he senses it. I do not know. I only know that the sightings are not random. They seem tied to some inner state, something difficult and heavy in me. Looking back now, I often think about how strange it is that I knew almost nothing about ghosts or paranormal things when all of this began. I was not a child feeding myself spooky stories. I did not grow up watching horror movies or reading haunted books. I did not go looking for this. It came into my life without warning and shaped itself before I even had the language for it. That matters to me, because it means my fear and confusion were honest from the start. I was not turning ordinary shadows into ghosts because I wanted excitement. If anything, I wanted a normal explanation more than anything else. And yet, the little things kept happening. The shoulder-like feeling of someone hovering when I sat at the computer. The mistaken impression that my sister was speaking when she was not. The shape of a child in the corner of my bedroom. The glimpse of a small boy in the basement when no one should have been there. The way my friends reacted to my room before I even told them what I had seen. It all slowly built into something that could not be brushed away. What unsettles me most now is not the fear, but the tenderness of some parts of it. Sammy never truly terrified me the way some hauntings terrify people. He startled me often, yes. He unsettled me. He confused me. But he did not feel cruel. He felt present. Sad sometimes. Quiet. Even B's story about him on the stairs did not carry a feeling of threat. He was happy that day, she said. Happy because it was my birthday. That small detail has stayed with me more than almost anything else. It makes me wonder who he was. Was he tied to the house itself? Did he belong to the land before we came there? Was he from another family? Another time? Another life somehow connected to mine? Because B said his eyes matched mine exactly, and that detail still bothers me in ways I cannot fully explain. Not because I think he was literally related to me in some simple sense, but because it suggests some connection deeper than chance. And maybe that is why I sometimes think about him in the language of reincarnation, of spiritual ties, of unfinished presence. I do not know if any of that is true, but it is hard not to wonder. The house itself remained beautiful to me, even while all this was happening. That is another strange thing. I did not stop loving it. It was still home. It was still the place where I grew, where my family lived, where ordinary life continued. The paranormal did not erase the house's beauty or warmth. It simply added another layer to it, one that most people would never understand unless they had felt it for themselves. That is often how these experiences work. The haunting, if that is what you want to call it, does not always replace life. Sometimes it slips into life and remains there quietly beside everything else. There are still moments when I think about Beyond the Stairs. I imagine her sitting there beside a little boy in overalls, talking to him casually, completely unaware that she was doing something extraordinary. I imagine him smiling at her, talking about a dinosaur toy, saying he was happy that day. There is something deeply sad and deeply beautiful in that picture. It feels like a stolen little piece of another world, one that crossed into ours just long enough for a conversation to happen. Bea was not afraid when she saw him because she did not know she should be. She saw a little boy and treated him kindly, and maybe that is why he responded so naturally to her. I also think about how Ella knew before I did in some ways. She had already seen him and kept it to herself because she did not want to scare me. That makes me realize how often people protect each other by staying silent about the things they cannot explain. But silence does not make those things disappear. It only leaves each person alone with their confusion until the day someone finally speaks. For me, that day changed everything. The moment Aloy admitted she had seen him too, the moment Bea described talking to him, the moment the pieces came together, all of that turned one strange personal experience into something shared. And once an experience is shared like that, it becomes harder to push away. It gains weight. It gains form. It becomes part of the history of a place and of the people in it. Even now, when I only catch quick glimpses of him, I still think of him as Sammy. It is strange how giving something a nickname can make it feel both more real and less frightening. Maybe we did that because we were young and needed some way to talk about him without sounding dramatic or terrified. Maybe we did it because a small blonde boy appearing in bedrooms and basements felt easier to bear if we gave him a soft, ordinary name. But the name stayed, and with it, the feeling that he was not simply some random dark force. He was a child. A presence. A mystery. Maybe even a lonely one. I do not know why he appears more when I am depressed. That part still troubles me. It makes me wonder whether he is drawn to sadness, or whether sadness simply opens my senses in some way. There are times when I have called out for him too, not even fully expecting anything, and then later I catch one of those small glimpses. Enough to remind me he is still there in some way. Not fully visible. Not like the boy B sat beside on the stairs. But present enough to make me stop and wonder if the years between then and now have changed less than I think. If someone asked me whether I believe in ghosts now, the answer is more complicated than yes or no. I believe that some things remain. I believe that houses can hold more than furniture and family memories. I believe that certain people or energies or spirits, whatever word is closest to the truth, do not always leave the way we assume they should. I believe that not every paranormal experience feels evil. Some feel sad. Some feel curious. Some feel unfinished. Sammy, to me, always felt unfinished. We never solved him. We never found out who he had been or why he was there. There was no big ending, no final revelation, no dramatic goodbye. He simply remained part of the house, part of our private understanding of it, appearing and fading as the years went on. In some ways that makes the story harder to tell, because people often want neat answers. But neat answers are not always what the paranormal gives you. Sometimes all you get is a glimpse, a shared story, and a feeling that something real happened even if you cannot prove it to the world. And that is exactly what Sammy became to me. A real mystery. A child in the corner of my room. A blonde boy in the basement. A smiling little figure in overalls sitting on the stairs at my birthday party. A presence who seemed happiest on the day I turned 14. A glimpse I still sometimes catch when the house feels heavy and my own heart does too. And after all these years, that is still enough to make me stop, listen, and wonder if he is nearby. I was living with my boyfriend at his parents' house in New York when all of this started. At first, it just felt like a normal living arrangement. It was not our own place, but it was still home in the everyday sense. We had our room, his parents were there, and his uncle also lived with us, though his room was down in the cellar. Like most families living under one roof, we had our routines, our quiet hours, and our little habits. On the outside, nothing looked unusual. It was just a family house with people coming and going, sleeping, eating, talking in the kitchen, and trying to get through life. But sometimes the most disturbing things begin in places that look completely ordinary. This all began about a month before I first told the story, just a few days before Christmas. It was late at night, or really early in the morning depending on how you look at it, around 2 in the morning. My boyfriend and I were in our bedroom watching television. The house was quiet in that deep way houses get when everyone else is asleep. His parents had already gone to bed, and since his uncle's room was down in the cellar, he was supposed to be downstairs by himself. Nothing felt strange at first. It just felt like another late night, the kind where the whole house seems to pause and only the television and your own thoughts are still awake. Then we heard a knock on our bedroom door. When my boyfriend opened it, his uncle was standing there, and it was clear right away that something was wrong. He was not just stopping by to say something casual, or ask a quick question. He looked shaken enough that he asked my boyfriend to come talk to him, and the two of them went out into the living room. I stayed nearby, and even before I heard the details, I could tell from the tone of everything that this was not some small misunderstanding. There was fear in the air already. His uncle explained that he had thought my boyfriend was playing some kind of joke on him at first. He had been downstairs in the cellar when he started hearing something tapping on his door. Not a random settling noise, not some little house sound you could ignore, but actual tapping on the door. Then his room got very cold. And not just slightly chilly. It got freezing in a way that felt wrong. Then, all of a sudden, the door burst open as if someone had kicked it hard. That was the part that really frightened him. The cellar was completely dark, so he could not see who or what had opened it. Since it was the middle of the night, and the sound had been at his door, he called out, thinking maybe my boyfriend had gone downstairs to mess with him. But it was not my boyfriend. According to his uncle, the moment he called out into the darkness, something growled at him. That is the kind of detail that changes the whole story. A door opening could maybe be explained away somehow. A draft, a bad latch, some physical thing in the house. But growling from the dark is different. It is immediate. Animal. Threatening. And the worst part was that it kept getting closer and closer. He said he got scared and started moving toward the cellar stairs, trying to get out of there. And as he did, he saw something between the cellar stairs that looked like a man walking across the cellar and straight into the wall. Not disappearing into darkness. Not slipping behind something. Walking into the wall. By the time he realized it definitely was not my boyfriend, he was truly terrified. At that point, it was no longer a maybe or a half joke or some weird little noise in the dark. It was something that had happened in front of him, in the blackness of the cellar, in a place where he had already felt exposed and alone. That was why he came upstairs. He needed someone else to hear him and hopefully tell him there was some explanation. My boyfriend, trying to be calm about it, decided to go downstairs with him and see if there was something there. I think part of him still wanted to find a normal explanation. That is how people usually react in the beginning. You do not immediately want to believe that something dark and unseen is moving around your house. You want a reason. You want to be able to say there was an animal, a person, a broken door, a light trick, anything. But the moment he walked down those stairs, he felt something too. He said that the hair on his body stood up. He could see his breath. That detail stayed with me strongly, because it matched what his uncle had already described. The cellar was suddenly cold enough that his breath was visible. That is not the kind of thing people imagine the same way by accident, especially in a shared house where they both know what the cellar normally feels like. My boyfriend also said he felt like there was something down there with him, but he could not see anything. That kind of feeling is hard to explain to someone who has not had it. It is not just fear. It is not just nerves because of what someone told you a minute before. It is that very specific sensation that a space is occupied even when your eyes find nothing. After that first night, things did not calm down. In fact, they got worse. The next night, we were all in the kitchen. Everyone was together, talking and playing Texas Hold'em. That is what makes what happens so much harder to dismiss. This was not one person alone in the cellar late at night already feeling nervous. This was the family together in one room, awake, talking, doing something normal. The atmosphere should have been safe because people were together. But that did not seem to matter. All of a sudden, the garbage can lifted up and got thrown across the room right in front of us. Not tipped over. Not nudged. Not falling by accident. Picked up and thrown. There is something especially frightening about an object moving with force in a room full of people, because in that moment everyone knows they saw the same thing. There is no private doubt left. No. Maybe it was just me. The whole room becomes a witness. And right after that happened, we heard crashing noises coming from the cellar. Then we heard the sound of someone running up the cellar stairs. That alone was enough to make my whole body go cold. You know how stairs sound when somebody is taking them fast. That is a very specific sound. It carries urgency. Weight. Intention. It sounds like a person hurrying toward you. And when those sounds are coming from a cellar that already had something growling in it the night before, your mind does not stay calm. It races ahead to the worst possibilities. By the time anyone checked downstairs, things had been knocked down and thrown across the room, and the cellar was freezing cold again. That was when the feeling in the house really changed. Up until then, even if the events were strange, a small part of everyone probably still wanted to act like maybe it would stop or maybe there was some ordinary reason hidden somewhere. But once things started moving in front of us, and the cellar itself felt charged with that same awful coldness, it became much harder to pretend. The whole family started feeling it. And it was not just fear in the obvious sense. It was something heavier, more draining, more constant. Everyone in the house, including me, began feeling depressed. That is one of the hardest parts to describe, because when people hear paranormal stories, they often focus only on the visible things. The thrown object. The footsteps. The noises. But sometimes the emotional change in the house is just as powerful, maybe more powerful. The whole place started to feel negative. Not just scary in isolated moments, but dark in a way that settled into people's moods. We all felt watched. That is another detail we had in common. It was not one person saying that and everyone else ignoring it. It was a shared feeling in the house, like something there was always paying attention to us from just out of sight. There was also the side door that went into the garage. It would open and slam by itself. Again, a person hearing that once might try to explain it with a draft, a bad latch, the wind, something simple. But when you are already living in a house where the cellar feels occupied, where a garbage can has been thrown in front of multiple people, where there are crashing sounds and running footsteps from below the house, a door repeatedly opening and slamming by itself stops feeling like a small household issue. It starts feeling like one more part of the same thing. I tried to keep doing ordinary things anyway. That is what people do when they live in a place that starts feeling wrong. You still have chores. You still need to wash clothes, clean up, move through the rooms, and keep living even while your nerves are on edge. So one day I went down into the cellar to do laundry. I did not want to go, but laundry still needed to be done. The whole time I was down there, I kept feeling like someone was standing behind me. That feeling is hard to shake once it starts. You are bent over the washer or dryer, and part of your mind stays fixed on the empty space behind you. You can feel your body wanting to turn around every few seconds. The room feels too still and too crowded at the same time. That is how it was for me. I did not see anyone. I did not hear growling that time. But the sensation of a presence directly behind me was so strong that I could not relax for a second. After that, I stopped wanting to go down there alone at all. Then about a week later, on January 14th, 2008, something happened that really got to me. It was around 5 in the morning when I woke up to the sound of someone banging on the walls outside my bedroom door, farther down the hallway. It was loud enough and clear enough to pull me straight out of sleep. There is a huge difference between a house creak and actual banging. This was not a random noise. It sounded like someone was there hitting the wall down the hall. I got up, opened my bedroom door, and looked. There was nothing there. No one in the hallway. No one moving away. No one awake. Everyone else in the house was still asleep. That sort of thing leaves you feeling helpless in a very particular way. Because once you have opened the door and found nothing, you are left standing there with your own fear and no clear target for it. If someone had been there, even some idiot playing a prank, at least the situation would have become understandable. But when the noise is real and the hallway is empty, the fear has nowhere to go. It just stays in you. By then I had already reached the point where I kept feeling like something bad was going to happen soon. That feeling is another thing people do not always understand unless they have lived in a house with constant activity. It is not just that things happen and you react. It is that after a while, you start living in a state of anticipation. Your body never fully settles. You expect the next noise, the next movement, the next cold wave of dread. And sometimes the worst part is not even the actual event. Sometimes it is the waiting, the sense that something is building, that the house is heading towards something you cannot see yet. I got to the point where I would not go into the cellar by myself anymore. And honestly, I do not think anyone can blame me for that. The cellar had become the center of almost everything. That was where his uncle had first heard the tapping, felt the sudden cold, seen the figure walk into the wall, and heard the growling from the dark. That was where my boyfriend felt the freezing air and the sensation that something unseen was present. That was where the crashing noises came from after the garbage can was thrown. That was where objects ended up scattered across the room. That was where the cold hit again and again. And when I went down there alone, I felt watched from behind. There is only so many times a person can tell themselves to be reasonable before their instincts start taking over. The strangest thing to me is how quickly the whole house seemed to change. It went from being a place where people lived together in a normal way to being a place where every room felt connected to some deeper tension. Even when nothing obvious was happening, the atmosphere itself felt wrong. The depression we all felt was part of that. It was like the whole house had become emotionally heavy, Being there drained you. It made you uneasy for no clear reason, even during quiet moments. A person can live in a tense home for normal reasons too: family stress, money, arguments, grief, all kinds of things. But this felt different. It felt like the negativity was part of the house itself. That is why I keep coming back to the word watched. Not every haunting story feels the same. Some are all about noises. Some are all about shadows or objects moving. But what ran through our whole experience was that constant sense of being observed. Not by curiosity. Not by something neutral. By something negative. Something aware. Something that seemed to enjoy making itself known just enough to keep everyone unsettled. The growling especially stays with me. A growl coming from darkness taps into a very old kind of fear. It does not sound human. It does not sound safe. It makes you think of something territorial, angry, animal, something warning you to stay away while at the same time moving closer. That detail alone would have been enough to disturb anyone. But because it was followed by the figure going into the wall, it became something worse than just a threatening sound. It became proof, at least to the people living through it, that this was not simply a strange animal in a basement. The fact that his uncle first thought it was my boyfriend playing a joke also says a lot. He was not someone who jumped immediately to ghost. He tried to make sense of it. He assumed it was another person in the house. He called out. He checked. Only after the growling and the figure did he panic. That progression matters, because it shows he started from a normal assumption. It was the experience itself that pushed him into fear, not a mind already set on the paranormal. The same goes for my boyfriend going down there to check. He did not run downstairs believing in demons or anything like that. He went to look because he wanted an explanation. But even he came back feeling that something was there. That gives the whole story a different kind of weight. It was not just one frightened person in the dark. It became a shared understanding. Then there is the garbage can. That image is hard to forget because it happened in a room full of people. If one person had seen something in the corner of their eye, that could be doubted. But a garbage can lifting and flying across a kitchen while people are all there together is different. There is no easy private explanation for that. It turns the room into a witness. It turns the event into something communal. And once that happens, whatever was in the house is no longer just bothering one person. It is announcing itself to everyone. I also think the timing near Christmas mattered emotionally. That time of year is supposed to feel warm, close, family-centered. A house should feel comforting then. But ours did not. Instead, it felt darker. The contrast between what a home should feel like and what ours felt like made everything worse. It is one thing to hear a weird noise in a place you already distrust. It is another to feel negativity filling a family home at a time when it should feel most safe and welcoming. Even now, the part that troubles me most is the feeling that something was building. That sense has not left me. At the time, I kept thinking that something worse was coming. I still do not know if that feeling was intuition, fear feeding on itself, or something genuinely warning me. But it was strong enough that I could not ignore it. It changed how I moved through the house. It changed how I slept. It changed whether I would go into certain places alone. It is also hard not to think about how the cellar became almost like another part of the house entirely. Above it, normal family life tried to continue. People slept, watched TV, played cards in the kitchen, did dishes, took care of daily things. But below all that was this space where the cold gathered, where the sounds came from, where things seemed to move on their own. Houses with basements already have a natural separation built into them. The basement feels like another layer under the life everyone sees. When strange activity begins in a place like that, it becomes very easy to feel that something has claimed that lower part of the house and is slowly pushing upward into the rest. And maybe that is exactly how it felt to us. At first it was his uncle in the cellar. Then my boyfriend went down there. Then the noises came up the stairs. Then the kitchen. Then the side door. Then the hallway outside my room. It felt like spread. Like something that started below us, and then kept reaching farther into the rest of the house. I do not know exactly what was there. I do not know whether it was attached to the house, to the land, to one person in the family, or to something none of us understood at all. I do not know if it had been there before we noticed it, quietly waiting, or if something triggered it. I do know this: whatever it was, it affected the whole house. It affected moods, sleep, fear, and the atmosphere itself. It was not just one isolated incident. It became part of daily life. And that is often what makes haunting experiences so difficult to explain to other people. When someone hears one event, they can always suggest one explanation. But when you are living inside a chain of events, the pattern becomes its own reality. The thrown garbage can, the footsteps, the growling, the figure in the dark, the freezing cellar, the slamming side door, the banging on the hallway walls, the sense of depression and being watched, all of it together begins to shape a world you cannot easily step out of. I think that is why, even now, I keep saying something negative was in that house. Not because I saw a devil standing in the room or had some neat proof, but because everything about it felt wrong. Heavy. Oppressive. Draining. It did not feel like a sad spirit or a harmless echo. It felt like something that liked fear. Something that changed the emotional temperature of the whole family. The worst part is that once a house starts feeling like that, you stop trusting your own comfort. Night is worse. Silence is worse. You hesitate before opening doors. You listen too hard. You expect the next sound. And ordinary things, like going down to do laundry, become loaded with dread. That is no way to live. So when I say I will not go into the cellar by myself anymore, I do not mean that lightly. I mean that every instinct in me says not to. Sometimes fear is irrational, but sometimes fear is your body understanding something before your mind has words for it. That cellar taught me the difference. In 1975, my family moved into a new house in South Minneapolis. At the time, it was my mother, my brother, my sister, and my sister's brand new baby daughter. We did not move there because we wanted a fresh start, or because we had fallen in love with the place. We moved because we had to. My mother's health had become a serious issue, and she needed a first-floor bedroom. The place we had before no longer suited her condition, so the move was made out of necessity, not excitement. Still, like most families forced into a big change, we tried to make the best of it. A new house always carries a strange feeling when you first enter it. It smells different, sounds different, and holds silence in a way that does not yet belong to you. We were all trying to settle in, to make the rooms ours, to create some normal life inside unfamiliar walls. Not long after we moved in, my father, who was my mother's ex-husband, came to live with us. He moved in mostly to help with bills, and because there was room for him, he built himself a bedroom in the basement. Ours was not a perfect family arrangement, but it worked in the practical way families sometimes do when life leaves them few easy choices. He had his space downstairs, while the rest of us settled into the main floor and upstairs. The house itself had an unusual feeling from the beginning, though no one said that out loud right away. At first, the strange things were small enough to dismiss. Houses make sounds. People hear things at odd hours. A family adjusting to a new home can easily blame nerves, routine, or imagination. That is how most hauntings begin, if that is what this was. Not with one giant impossible event, but with little moments that keep repeating until they can no longer be ignored. One of the first odd patterns centered around my father. He was an extremely early riser, the kind of person who would be awake at 3 or 4 in the morning as naturally as other people wake at 7. In those quiet hours, when everyone else in the house was still asleep, he would hear a baby crying from the upstairs rooms. At first, that made perfect sense on the surface because my sister lived upstairs with her infant daughter. If you hear a baby cry in a house where a baby lives, you do not question it. But the strange part was that it was never actually the baby. Whenever the crying was heard, my niece would be completely sound asleep. The crying would be clear enough for him to notice, but when he checked or listened more closely, there would be no explanation for it. It was as if the house itself had learned how to create the sound of an infant, even when no child was awake. That was only the beginning. On two separate occasions, my sister woke in the middle of the night and looked over toward the crib in the next room. The upstairs had an open floor plan, with large archway doorways instead of regular doors, so from her position she could easily see into the area where the baby slept. On those nights, when she looked over, she saw a little girl standing next to the crib. Not moving wildly, not screaming, not doing anything dramatic. Just standing there beside the baby. Somehow, instead of reacting in total panic, she brushed it off and went back to sleep. That detail has always fascinated me, because it says something about how people respond when they are caught between sleep and waking. Sometimes the impossible arrives so quietly that the mind refuses to deal with it in the moment. It chooses instead to fold the experience into the night and put it away until morning. My sister saw the little girl twice and still went back to bed, perhaps because some part of her could not believe what she was seeing, or perhaps because the figure itself did not feel openly threatening then. A few years later there was another sighting, this time by my father. By then, my sister had married and moved out with her daughter, so the upstairs no longer belonged to them. My father, still the early riser, was one morning standing in the doorway between the living room and dining room. That was a habit of his. He liked to stand there and look out the front picture window, taking in the neighborhood before the rest of the world woke up properly. It was just one of those ordinary routines people build over the years. On this particular morning, he happened to glance down beside him. There, standing right next to him, was a little girl. He looked up for a split second, perhaps in instinctive surprise, and when he looked back down, she was gone. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. By that point, the little girl had already appeared near the crib years earlier, so her presence beside him in the doorway gave the earlier incidents a new kind of weight. It was no longer just one person half asleep seeing something she could not explain. It was a recurring figure moving through the life of the house. After my sister moved out, my father said that the crying he used to hear from upstairs became more frequent. That detail matters to me, because it suggests that whatever was in the house had not been attached only to my sister or her daughter. If anything, it became more noticeable after they were gone. That implies the house itself was the center of it, not just one member of the family. A little girl by the crib. A little girl beside my father. Crying from upstairs even when no baby was awake. These things built slowly over time, and because they were spread out, they probably seemed easier to live with than one huge terrifying event would have been. But in hindsight, they form a very clear pattern. Years passed, and as family life shifted, the upstairs eventually became my space. It was basically 3 rooms to myself, and for a while that felt like a good thing. Houses evolve like that. One family member moves out, another claims a room, new uses are found for old spaces. At one point, we rented out my old bedroom to a friend of mine who needed somewhere to stay. That is when other people from outside the family began experiencing things too, which to me has always been one of the strongest signs that what happened there was not just family nerves or imagination. One night, my friend came home with his girlfriend. He had gone straight to his room, while my mother and I stayed in the living room watching television. Just a few minutes later, he came back out looking puzzled and asked me if I had been upstairs. I told him no. He stood there for a second with a strange expression on his face before explaining why he asked. He said that as he and his girlfriend pulled up in front of the house, they looked toward the upstairs windows and saw someone inside putting boards over the windows from the inside. That is such a specific, unsettling image that it stayed with me right away. Boards over the windows suggest fear, urgency, or confinement. It is not the kind of thing the mind casually invents. Since I was the one who slept upstairs, hearing that made me deeply uncomfortable. But when I finally forced myself to go up to bed that night, delaying it as long as possible, there was nothing there. No boards, no signs that anyone had touched the windows, nothing out of place at all. Another friend of the family had a different sighting from outside the house. My brother's girlfriend once came over for a family gathering. As she arrived and looked up toward the upstairs window, she said she saw a little girl standing there waving at them. The troubling part was that no one was upstairs at the time. It was one more report involving the same kind of figure that had already been seen inside. These outside sightings always made the house feel worse to me somehow, because they meant the strange things were not confined to dim rooms and lonely late-night moments. They appeared in daylight too, and to people arriving from outside with no reason to expect them. Now, when I think back on the personal experiences I had, I realize they came after years of the house already proving itself strange. That may be why I was able to keep living there as long as I did. The haunting, if that is the right word, had become part of the house's character by then. Strange, yes. Unsettling, yes. But almost woven into the daily life of the place. Even so, a couple of things that happened to me directly remain as clear as if they happened yesterday. The first happened a couple of years before my mother and father passed away. By then, the only people living in the house were my parents and me. It was near Christmas, and we had a metal wardrobe in what had once been my old bedroom. My mother asked me to go check for one of the gifts to make sure we did not accidentally buy a duplicate. It was a simple errand. I walked back there, tried the cabinet, and found it locked. So I went to the kitchen to get the key from the key rack by the inside kitchen door, where it was always usually kept. It was not there. I searched the rack carefully and still did not find it. Then I went back to the bedroom to see if maybe the key had been left in there somewhere. No luck. I returned to the rack one more time, thinking perhaps I had missed it, but it still was not there. Finally, as I was walking back toward the bedroom again, I stepped on something sharp and metallic lying on the floor between the kitchen and the bedroom. It was the key. Now, a person can come up with explanations for that. Maybe it had fallen from a pocket. Maybe it had somehow been knocked off something earlier and gone unnoticed. But what still bothers me is that the room had just been vacuumed that day. If the key had been on the floor before, it should have been found or sucked up. The moment itself was not terrifying. It was just one of those little impossible-seeming things that happened in that house, the sort of detail that feels minor until you collect enough of them and realize how often normal objects in that place refuse to behave normally. My last experience in that house is the one that stays with me most strongly, not because it was the loudest or most violent, but because of how quietly impossible it felt. By then, my wife-to-be and I were in the house cleaning up much of the mess left behind from my moving out. My parents had recently died, and we had spent hours sorting through things, clearing debris, and trying to leave the place in some kind of order. When we finally finished cleaning, we sat at the dining room table, which was one of the pieces of furniture we were leaving behind. We sat there for quite a while, talking about my family and my recently deceased parents. The house felt full of memory that day, the kind of heaviness that comes after loss when every room reminds you of who once stood there. At one point I noticed the hall light was on. It was an old round fluorescent fixture with a pulled chain. I remember mentioning it to her, and saying she should remind me to turn it off before we left. Then we went back to talking. About an hour passed like that. We were both sitting there the whole time. Neither of us moved around the house. We were alone. When we finally got up and prepared to leave, I remembered that I had meant to turn off that hall light. But when I looked down the hallway, it was already off. We had not left the table, and there had been no one else in the house. I went over to the fixture and pulled the chain a couple of times just to make sure it worked properly, and that there was nothing wrong with it. It worked exactly as it should. After that, we decided very quickly that it was time to leave. That moment stayed with me because of its simplicity. It was not dramatic. No ghostly figure appeared. No voices echoed down the hall. No objects flew across the room. Just a light, quietly switched off in an empty house by unseen hands, while two living people sat and remembered the dead. In some ways, that felt more personal than anything else. It felt less like a haunting and more like a reminder that the house was never completely empty, at least not in the way most houses are. I have not been inside that house since 1991. Even so, it remains in the family. My sister and her husband live there now. I keep asking them whether anything strange has happened, whether the little girl still appears, whether the crying still comes from nowhere, whether lights still behave oddly or rooms feel occupied. So far, they have not reported any new occurrences. That is interesting to me, but it does not erase what happened before. Houses can go quiet for long stretches. Maybe whatever was there has finally settled. Maybe it still moves through the place in ways too small to notice. Or maybe it waits for the right person, the right moment, the right emotional opening. I do not know. What I do know is that this was not a house with just one odd event. It carried its own history of little disturbances and witnesses from different times. My father heard crying when no baby cried. My sister saw a little girl twice beside the crib. My father later saw a little girl beside him in the doorway. My friend and his girlfriend saw someone at the upstairs windows putting boards over them, though nothing was there when I checked. My brother's girlfriend saw a little girl waving from the upstairs window when no one was upstairs. I found a key where it should not have been. And finally, in the silence after my parents were gone, a hall light turned itself off while my future wife and I sat talking about the dead. When you put all that together, it becomes difficult to pretend it was all coincidence. What stays with me most strongly is the little girl. She seems to run through the whole story like a thread tying the house together. She was seen by the crib when my niece was a baby. She stood next to my father. She appeared in the upstairs window waving. She seemed woven into the house's identity. And yet, there was also the crying of an unseen baby, the strange figure at the window putting up boards, and the small physical disturbances that cannot be tied neatly to her. That makes me think the house may have held more than one kind of presence, or at least more than one layer of memory. I have often wondered whether the history of the house itself could explain any of it. Was there once a child there? Was there a family tragedy? Was there some emotional event so strong that it left an imprint on the place? Houses, especially older houses, gather lives inside them. Over the years they hold grief, joy, loneliness, anger, birth, illness, death, secrets, habits, silence, and all the strange emotional residue people leave behind. Most of the time we never notice those layers. But sometimes, in certain places, some part of that past seems unwilling to stay quiet. Another thing that fascinates me is how many of the experiences involved ordinary domestic space. It was not a dark attic or creepy basement at first. It was the upstairs where a baby slept. A doorway where my father stood in the early morning. A bedroom window. A key on the floor between the kitchen and bedroom. A hallway light. The haunting, if that is what it was, lived among the plain routine areas of the home. That somehow makes it more believable to me. Most real haunting stories do not happen only in dramatic corners. They happen where life happens. They happen where people sleep, cook, talk, and walk from room to room. I also think the timing of my last experience mattered. Grief changes a house. After parents die, the rooms they lived in do not feel the same. The objects remain, but the air around them changes. Memory hangs heavier. Silence has more depth. Sitting there with my wife-to-be, talking about my recently deceased parents, I think we had made the house emotionally open in some way. Maybe the light going off was just one more small thing in a long history of strange little happenings. Or maybe, in that moment, it was something gentler. A final acknowledgement from a house that had held our family for years. I do not know. But it felt like enough to send us out the door quickly, and neither of us argued about leaving. Even now, though decades have passed, I still ask about that house. Maybe that says something about how deeply it marked me. If it had only been one odd story from childhood, perhaps I would have forgotten it or turned it into family folklore. But because the events happened across years and touched so many different people, the place itself remains alive in my memory. Not just as a house we lived in, but as a place that seemed to look back at us. A place where unseen things moved through ordinary rooms. A place where an early rising man heard a crying infant that did not cry, where a sister saw a child by the crib, where a father found a little girl at his side, where visitors saw impossible figures at windows, and where lights did not always wait for human hands. My sister and her husband live there now, and perhaps the house has grown quiet with time. Or perhaps some houses simply choose when to speak. Either way, I cannot think of that place as an ordinary family home. Not anymore. Too much happened there, and too many people, each in their own way, were touched by something they could not explain. I grew up in a small town in Michigan, and when I think back on my childhood, one of the first things that comes to my mind is how free everything felt. The world seemed wide, even though our lives were simple. We did not need much to stay busy. The yard was enough. The street was enough. A few trees, a fence, a handful of rocks, a bug crawling through the grass, and suddenly a whole afternoon was full of adventure. My brothers and I spent so much of our time outside that it felt like nature itself helped raise us. We ran through the yard, chased each other until we were breathless, made games out of almost nothing, and found ways to turn ordinary things into excitement. Looking back, it was a happy childhood in many ways. We did not know how small our town was, because to us it felt like the center of everything. Sometimes we would play near the fence that separated our yard from the one next door. It was one of those old, bouncy fences that seemed fun to children and irritating to adults. We thought it was great fun to swing on it, and lean on it, and watch it wobble. The neighbor, of course, did not find that charming at all. The more we messed with it, the more bent and tired it became, and every time he saw us near it, he would get upset and chase us away. To us, he was just the old man next door who hated what children considered fun. To him, we were probably a pack of noisy little troublemakers slowly destroying his fence. Still, for all the times he got angry over that fence, most of the time we were good kids. We were loud and energetic, yes, but not mean. We were simply children, and children do not always understand the difference between harmless fun and becoming a headache to adults. The older couple who lived next door were quiet people. They kept to themselves most of the time and did not seem especially interested in neighborhood noise or gossip. They were the kind of neighbors you notice more by their routines than by their words. The husband would come and go. The wife would sometimes sit outside when the weather was nice. They were not unfriendly. In fact, I always thought of them as nice old people, though there was a sadness around them even when I was too young to understand what sadness in adults really meant. Whenever I saw the husband coming or going, I would sometimes run up to him the way children do, with no sense of hesitation or distance. I would say, "Hello, mister, how is your missus?" He would nod and tell me she was fine. But there was always something strange in the way he said it. Even as a little girl, I could feel it. There was a heaviness in him, something behind the simple answer. A child may not understand the full meaning of suffering, but a child can still sense when something is wrong. Every time he answered me, it felt like part of him was somewhere else. He was polite. He was calm. But he seemed sad in a deep and quiet way. His wife was even more mysterious to me. She would often sit on the front porch when the weather was fair, or sometimes near the window in a rocking chair, moving gently back and forth. When I saw her outside, I would run to the porch and call out, "Hello, missus," and wave. She almost never really spoke. Usually, she would just nod her head slightly in acknowledgement. She always seemed wrapped in stillness. She often wore a shawl, and she almost always had on a long dark dress. Her gray hair was pulled up into a bun, and to me, that alone made her seem very old. I thought maybe she got cold easily, and that was why she always wore that shawl, even when I thought the weather seemed perfectly nice. She seemed fragile and far away, as if her body was in front of me but her thoughts were somewhere else. Even then, I think I felt more around her than I understood. I was around 6 or 7 years old then. People used to say I looked like Punky Brewster. I had freckles across my nose and short, choppy hair, and I was a bit of a tomboy because I had 6 brothers. 3 of them were younger than me, which meant I was often climbing, running, wrestling, jumping, and doing whatever the boys were doing. I was not the kind of little girl who sat inside and stayed neat. I was always in motion, usually with dirt on my knees and some wild story in my head. Everything amused me when I was little. The world felt alive to me in a way that I now understand was very special. When I walked outside, I did not just see a yard. I felt like I was stepping into a place full of friends. The wind was my friend. The trees were my friends. Butterflies, ants, crickets, falling leaves, patches of sunlight on the grass, all of it seemed to speak in a language I did not need words to understand. Sometimes the wind would suddenly stir up around me and swirl the leaves into a perfect little circle. I would laugh and spin in the opposite direction, as if the wind and I were playing together. Nature never felt empty to me. It felt aware. It felt affectionate. I had real friends and a large family, yes, but nature caught my imagination in a different way. It made the world feel bigger and more magical than adults ever seemed to realize. Then, little by little, I noticed I had not seen the old man or his wife very much. At that age, time moves strangely. Days feel long, but weeks can pass without a child realizing it. I faintly remember people coming and going from their house dressed in black, but I was too young to understand the meaning of that fully. My attention was usually fixed on whatever small and important task I had given myself that day. Maybe I was collecting rocks. Maybe I was making up stories with my brothers. Maybe I was talking to the wind again. Whatever the case, I did not stop and ask questions the way I might have if I had been older. One day, though, I saw the wife again. She was sitting on the front porch, rocking back and forth just as she often had before. She was wearing the same kind of dark dress, the same shawl, and her hair was up in the same gray bun. At first glance, nothing looked different. And yet something was very different. I could feel it immediately. She seemed farther away than before, farther than ordinary sadness, farther than sickness, farther than silence. It was like she was there and not there at the same time. It is hard to explain that kind of feeling, especially from the memory of a child. But the best way I can put it is that she seemed as if she belonged partly to another place. She did not just seem quiet. She seemed distant in a way that made the air around her feel strange. I waved at her, as I always did. She looked at me, but she did not nod or respond the way she usually had. That was one of the things I noticed most. Her usual small acknowledgement was gone. She just looked. I saw her several times that week. Sometimes she was on the porch in the rocking chair. Other times she seemed to be in the window, sitting and rocking back and forth there too. I was busy being a child, so I did not stop my whole life to study it. I would wave when I saw her, and then go back to my games. But every time I saw her, I felt that same strange distance around her, as though she had become less part of the ordinary world and more part of something I could not understand. Later that same day, I saw the old man coming home. He was walking slowly toward his house, and there was such sadness in the way he moved that I remember it even now. As children do, I ran right up to him without thinking. I said, "Hello, mister, I saw your missus sitting on the porch and rocking in her rocking chair and in the window too. She was rocking back and forth." The moment I said that, something in his face changed. He looked at me strangely and shook his head no. I remember being confused because I knew what I had seen. I was not guessing. I was not making up a story. So I insisted. I told him yes, I did see her. I remember feeling almost offended by the way he looked at me, because in my child's mind the truth was very simple. I had seen his wife, and I was telling him that. But then he spoke very calmly and told me something that stopped me completely. He said, "My missus is dead. She has been dead for a couple of weeks now." I was struck speechless. There are moments in childhood when you realize the world is bigger and stranger than you had believed, and the mind cannot catch up fast enough. That was one of those moments for me. I knew I had seen her. I had seen her on the porch. I had seen her by the window. I even described what she was wearing. He looked at me with that same sad, strange expression, then slowly went inside his house, still shaking his head no, as if he could not bear what I had just said or could not make sense of it himself. But I had seen her. And it was not the last time. After that conversation, I still saw her now and then. Not constantly. Not every day. But enough that the memory of her never left me. And every time I saw her, the same question rose in my mind. If she was dead, then why could I still see her? Should she not have been invisible? That is what made no sense to me as a child. I had no real understanding of ghosts or spirits. I did not know what people meant by lingering after death. So when I kept seeing her as though she were still living, still wearing her shawl, still rocking back and forth. It did not fit into anything I understood. It was not like in stories where ghosts are pale lights or frightening apparitions. She looked real. That was what made it harder to understand. I wanted to speak to her again. I wanted to walk up to her and ask her who she was now, what had happened, why she kept appearing. But I was afraid. If she was really dead, then what did that mean? Why did she look so normal? Why did she still sit as she always had? Why did she not seem to speak? Why did she keep appearing as though nothing had changed except the strange distance around her? Not long after, I overheard my mother talking to some neighbors and on the phone. She said she swore that she had seen that woman sitting in the window, rocking in her rocking chair. The woman who had died. I remember hearing that and feeling something deep and quiet settle inside me. I was not the only one. My mother had seen her too. But I did not tell her I had seen her as well. There are times when a child senses that saying the truth out loud will only complicate things. My mother would stop talking whenever she noticed us children nearby, so I understood that whatever she was saying was not meant for us. My younger brothers said they did not see the woman. It seemed to be only some of us, and not others. As I grew older, I never forgot her. I thought about her many times over the years. Eventually, the story settled into me in a softer way. I began to believe that maybe she and her husband had been together for so long that she could not leave him right away. Maybe she had to come back now and then. Maybe she had to sit in her chair, on her porch, by her window, close to the life she had known, close to the man she had left behind. Maybe she was saying goodbye little by little, in the only way she knew how. That was not the last strange thing I would ever experience. In fact, over the years I came to realize that I seemed to be visited by those who had died and passed over. Sometimes family members would make themselves known to me. My father visited me around the time of his death. My mother did too. And from those experiences, I slowly formed an understanding that I still carry with me now. I have noticed that when people die, they do not always go to the other side right away. Sometimes they linger. Sometimes they stay close to the people they love. Sometimes they seem lost. Sometimes they seem to live among us for a little while, not fully gone, not fully present in the way the living are, but still here enough to be felt or seen. I do not claim to understand all the reasons. I only know what I have experienced. There have been times when I could sense them clearly, as if the veil between this world and whatever comes after had become thinner for a moment. I do not see them as often now as I once did, but every now and then I still do. And when I do, they do not always appear in the same way. Sometimes they look as real as any living person. That was how the old woman next door appeared to me. That was what made her presence so confusing. She did not look transparent or strange in some obvious ghostly way. She looked like herself. Other times, the dead seemed to hide in shadows. When my father died, I sensed him standing in my closet in the dark. That may sound frightening, but in a strange way it also felt familiar, because my father used to spy on me when I was alive, trying to catch me doing something wrong. So when I sensed him there after death, it fit him in a way that felt almost natural, even though it was unnerving. And then there are times when they appear in even stranger ways. My mother once visited me floating near the ceiling. That too frightened me. There is no way around it. Even when the dead mean no harm, it is still terrifying when the rules of the world suddenly stop behaving the way you expect. A mother on the ceiling is not something the mind accepts easily, no matter how much love you carry for her. Still, I have come to believe that most of them do not mean us any harm. More often than not, they seem to come with messages. Not always clear-spoken messages, but messages of presence, encouragement, love, or farewell. They want to be known. They want you to understand that they are still near for a little while. Sometimes they are there because they are not ready to leave. Sometimes they stay because the people they love are still holding them with grief. Sometimes they simply need to pass through once more before continuing on. That does not make it easy. It is still scary. No matter how often I try to explain it gently, there is still fear in these moments. Seeing someone who should be gone but is still there, real enough to mistake for the living, changes something in you. It makes the world less solid than it was before. It teaches you that there may be more around us than most people notice. It opens a door in the mind that never fully closes again. And when I think back to the very first spirit I clearly remember seeing, it is still that old woman next door. I see her as she was in life and as she was in death. The dark dress, the shawl, the gray hair in a bun, the rocking chair moving back and forth. I remember the sadness in her husband every time I asked how she was, long before I knew why. I remember waving to her from the yard. I remember the strange faraway feeling around her after she died, like she was no longer fully anchored in our world. I remember the look on the old man's face when I told him I had seen her. I remember the way he slowly shook his head and walked away. And I remember that even after that, I kept seeing her. Not in a nightmare. Not in a story. Not because I wanted to. But because she was still there, in some way, trying to remain close to the life and love she had known. Maybe that is why I was able to understand later visits from the dead a little better. Because she was the first to show me that death is not always as immediate and final as people say it is. Sometimes there is a pause. Sometimes there is a lingering. Sometimes there is a rocking chair in a window, a wave from a porch, a presence in a room, a feeling in the wind, or a loved one standing in the dark where no living person should be. The world looked different to me after that. Nature still felt like my friend. The wind still danced around me. The leaves still swirled when I spun. But now I also knew that unseen things moved through the world too, and sometimes they made themselves visible if only for a little while. As a child, I did not have language for any of it. As an adult, I still do not have all the answers. But I know what I saw. And I know that sometimes the dead come back, not to hurt us, but because some part of them is not finished saying goodbye. I have lived in a house with paranormal activity for the last 4.5 years. By now, strange things happening there are not new to my family. We have seen shadow people, heard voices, and even seen full apparitions. We have caught orbs on camera, and we have recorded EVPs as well. On top of all that, my 13-year-old daughter is very sensitive. She regularly sees and speaks with spirits, not only in our home but in other places too. Because of that, paranormal experiences have become a normal part of life for us in a way that would probably sound impossible to people who have never dealt with it. My husband, my 2 daughters, and I even go on paranormal investigations whenever we get the chance. And one thing I have noticed over time is that the more we do those investigations, the more activity seems to follow us home or make itself known around us in other places. It is almost like once you open that door, it becomes easier for things to reach through. Even with all of that experience, some moments still catch me off guard. There are certain kinds of paranormal events that feel easier to handle because they fit into patterns you already know. A shadow moving in the corner of your eye. A voice in another room. The sense that someone is standing nearby when no one living is there. Those things are strange, yes, but after years of dealing with them, they become part of the background of life. But then every once in a while, something happens that feels oddly ordinary at first, and then turns deeply unsettling the second you realize what it really was. That is exactly the kind of experience this was. It happened recently on one of those rare, quiet days when I actually had time to do almost nothing. That almost never happens. Usually there is always something to take care of, some responsibility, some task, some reason I cannot just lie down and relax in the middle of the day. But that day I had the chance to stay in my room and simply watch television. I was stretched out on my bed, the bedroom door was shut, and I was enjoying the unusual peace of having a little time to myself. The house was quiet in the comfortable way it often is during the day when not much is going on. At that moment, the only other living person in the house was my older daughter, who was 17. She was in her bedroom in the basement, which is on the other end of the house from mine. So even though someone else was home, I still felt fairly alone in that part of the house. There was no one moving around near me, no conversation, no reason to expect any activity in the hallway or bathroom. It was just me in my room, watching TV and enjoying the silence. Then I heard someone go into the main bathroom. That bathroom is on the other side of my closet wall, so I know the sounds from there very well. Houses teach you that over time. You learn the exact sound of a door opening, of footsteps crossing a floor, of a faucet running, of a shower turning on. You do not even think about it consciously anymore because it becomes so familiar. That is why I did not question it when I first heard movement in the bathroom. It sounded completely normal. A person went in, the shower turned on, and water began running the way it always does when someone decides to shower. The shower stayed on for what felt like 5 to 10 minutes. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I assumed my daughter had decided to take a late afternoon shower. That made perfect sense to me. Teenagers keep odd schedules sometimes, and it would not have been unusual for her to decide to shower at that hour. So I stayed on the bed and kept watching TV, not feeling the slightest bit disturbed. It was just another ordinary house sound, another sign that someone else was home and going about their routine. Then I heard a child's voice say, "Mommy!" That was the moment everything shifted. I got up off the bed right away. My first thought was still practical and ordinary. I thought maybe my daughter needed a towel from the linen closet in the hallway. That happened often enough that it was the first explanation that came to mind. I remember thinking, even in that moment, that her voice had sounded younger than her actual 17-year-old voice. It struck me briefly as odd, but not odd enough to stop me. I told myself there was probably some simple reason for it. Maybe it sounded different because the bedroom door had been shut. Maybe the sound had echoed strangely out of the small bathroom. Maybe it only seemed younger because I had heard it through a wall first, and then through the hallway. In that moment, I did what people so often do when something does not fit quite right. I reached for the easiest normal explanation and kept moving. I crossed the room and opened my bedroom door. As I stepped into the hallway and moved toward the linen closet, I glanced at the bathroom door. And that was when I froze. The bathroom door was standing wide open. The lights were off. There was no sign that anyone had been in there at all. The feeling that hit me in that second is hard to describe. It was not the sudden jump scare kind of fear. It was more like the floor of reality shifted under me. Up until that moment, everything had made sense. I had heard the shower running. I had heard a child's voice call, "Mommy!" I had walked into a hallway expecting to help my daughter. And then, with one glance, the whole story fell apart. The bathroom was dark and empty looking. The door was open as if no one had ever shut it for a shower. It looked untouched. Wrong. Silent in a way that no bathroom should be after someone has just been showering and calling for a towel. That was when I knew with full certainty that it had not been my daughter. I stood there and called out, "Mommy is here. Do you need something? Are you there?" I do not even know exactly why I chose those words, except that in the moment they felt natural. If a child had called for mommy, then my instinct was to answer as a mother would. Maybe part of me still hoped there was some simple mistake, that I would hear my daughter laugh from another room, or that somehow someone would answer and the whole thing would settle into something understandable. But no answer came. I waited. I listened. There was no movement. No voice. No sound of wet feet on the tile. No rustling from the bathroom. Nothing. The hallway was still, and the house had that strange empty quiet it sometimes gets after something unexplained has just happened, as if even the walls are waiting to see what you will do next. I stood there for a couple of minutes, not wanting to overreact, and yet already knowing in my gut that what I had experienced was not normal. Finally, I went downstairs to my daughter's room and asked her directly whether she had taken a shower and called for me. She said no. She had not taken a shower. She had not called my name. She had not even been near that part of the house. That was the moment when the experience moved from unsettling to undeniable. It is one thing to suspect something strange. It is another to have the normal explanation removed completely. I also knew the windows in the house had been closed because it was a cold late fall day. So there was no way some child outside had called in from the yard or from open windows. The voice had been inside the house. Clear enough for me to hear. real enough for me to answer. I never did figure out exactly where that voice came from. And that is part of what makes the whole thing stay with me. It did not end with a shadow crossing a doorway or an object moving in front of my eyes. It ended with absence. An empty bathroom. An open door. A dark room. No one there. Just the certainty that I had heard a shower and a child's voice calling for mommy, and the knowledge that there was no living child in that part of the house at all. What still bothers me is how normal it all felt at first. That is often what makes paranormal experiences especially disturbing. Not always the dramatic part, but the way they slip into everyday life wearing the shape of something ordinary. Showers running. A voice calling from the bathroom. A mother getting up to help. There is something deeply unsettling about the supernatural borrowing the sounds of ordinary domestic life. It makes the house itself feel less trustworthy. After that, you start wondering how many other normal sounds might not be what they seem. I also still laugh at myself a little for not thinking to check the tub. That thought did not occur to me until afterward. In the moment I was so focused on the empty bathroom and the voice that I never checked whether the tub or shower floor was wet. If I had, that might have made the whole thing even more frightening. If the shower had truly been dry, then it would have confirmed in a physical way what I already suspected. And if it had been wet, then that would have opened up an entirely different kind of question. Either possibility would have been disturbing. Looking back now, I wish I had thought to look, even though I know it might have scared me even more. The strange thing is that this experience did not happen in isolation. My younger daughter has seen a little boy peeking up the stairway near that same bathroom door. That detail always comes back to me when I think about the child's voice calling, "Mommy!" If there is a little boy in the house who has already made himself known to her, then maybe it was him I heard that afternoon. Maybe he had gone into the bathroom, or seemed to, and called out the way a child naturally would. Maybe he wanted attention. Maybe he only wanted to be acknowledged. Maybe he was replaying some small piece of life that once belonged to him. That possibility unsettles me, but it also oddly softens the fear a little. Because there is something less threatening about a little boy calling for mommy than there is about a dark shape or a hostile voice. It is still disturbing, of course. I do not want unexplained spirits using my bathroom or calling out to me from empty rooms. But the emotional tone of it feels different. It feels more human. More sad, maybe? More like a child still trying to live inside familiar patterns, still calling out the way children do, still expecting an answer from a mother who may no longer be there. That may be why, after all the years of activity in our house, this experience stayed with me in a particular way. We have seen shadow people. We have heard voices. We have captured orbs on camera. We have picked up EVPs. My daughter has spoken with spirits openly. We investigate haunted locations and bring ourselves into contact with energies most people spend their whole lives trying to ignore. So in one sense, my family is not new to this. We are not easily shocked by the existence of paranormal activity. And yet, this moment still got under my skin. Maybe because it touched on something so familiar and intimate. A child calling for mommy from the bathroom is such a normal household sound. It reaches right into your instincts. As a mother, you answer that call automatically. You do not stop to question it. You move. You respond. And when there is no one there, it leaves a strange ache behind as well as fear. It also made me think again about the way our home seems to grow more active the more investigations we do. I have said many times that the more we open ourselves to paranormal experiences outside the house, the more we seem to invite them into our home life too. I do not mean that in a reckless way. We do not go looking to be haunted. But when you spend time in places filled with residual energy, with spirits, with unresolved presence, I think you become easier to notice somehow. Easier to reach. Easier to follow. Maybe our home has simply become a place where those energies find it easier to appear. And in our house, they appear in different forms. Sometimes it is a shadow. Sometimes a voice. Sometimes a little boy by the stairs. Sometimes the recorded evidence of an EVP or orb. And sometimes, as happened that day, it is the sound of a shower and a child's voice in an empty bathroom. I often think about what that child's spirit might have wanted from me in that moment. Did he really want a towel? Did he want attention? Was he simply replaying a memory, not aware of me at all until I answered? Was he testing whether I could hear him? Spirits in a home do not always behave in the same way, and that makes them difficult to understand. Some seem aware of the living. Some seem caught in routine. Some respond when spoken to. Others do not. That afternoon, whatever it was, did not answer me when I called back. That silence made the whole thing more mysterious. If I had heard another word, another step, another sound, perhaps I would have felt I understood the encounter better. Instead, it ended with emptiness and questions. The open bathroom door still stands out strongly in my memory too. That was the visual detail that broke the illusion. If I had stepped into the hallway and found the door shut, steam inside, or any sign of recent movement, then maybe my mind would have stayed in that ordinary frame a little longer. But the full open door and the darkness inside were so wrong compared to what I had just heard that they hit me immediately. It was like walking into the answer to a question you did not know you were asking. In that instant, I knew the sound I had heard was not part of normal life. And yet I answered it anyway. That part feels important to me. Maybe because it reminds me that whatever is in our house, no matter how strange, still often approaches through familiar human patterns. It calls out. It waits in doorways. It peeks around corners. It uses voices. It does not always come crashing in with terror. Sometimes it slips in through the ordinary sounds of home, making itself part of our life in ways that are harder to resist because they feel natural at first. That is true of a lot of our activity, really. Paranormal things in our house are not always huge dramatic events. Sometimes they are the small things that force you to look twice. The shape at the edge of the hall. The voice you hear when no one living is there. The feeling of being watched. The way one daughter sees and speaks to spirits naturally while the rest of us react after the fact. Over time, those things create a house where the line between ordinary and paranormal is thinner than it should be. I suppose that is why I can end this particular story with humor, even though it was strange and unsettling. I still joke that I wish the little boy had waited around for the towel. That kind of humor helps. When you live in a house with activity for years, you either find moments to laugh or you let fear eat holes through all of daily life. My family has learned to do both, to take the activity seriously, and still find little ways to speak about it without letting it control us completely. But underneath that joke, the experience still lingers. Because I know what I heard. I know there was a shower running. I know a child's voice called, "Mommy!" I know the bathroom was empty when I opened the door. And I know my daughter was nowhere near that end of the house. That is enough to keep the memory alive. Even after all the investigations, all the shadow people, the voices, the apparitions, the orbs, the EVPs, and all the years of living with paranormal activity, there are still moments that stay with you in a very personal way. This is one of those moments for me. Not because it was the most violent, or the most visually dramatic, but because it was so strangely intimate. It reached into something simple and maternal and turned it into a mystery I could not solve. Maybe it was the little boy by the stairs. Maybe it was some other child's spirit passing through. Maybe it was a replay from another time in the house. I do not know. All I know is that one late fall afternoon, while I lay on my bed enjoying a rare quiet day, something in my house took a shower, called out for Mommy, and vanished before I could answer properly. And that is the kind of thing a person does not forget. I had never really planned on talking about what I saw. For a long time, I kept it to myself because I did not know what to call it, and I did not think many people would understand it anyway. Then one day, by chance, I read a story about shadow people, and something in me stopped cold. I realized that maybe what I had seen had a name after all. Before that, I had always thought of our house as haunted, but not in the usual way people imagine when they hear that word. It was not some old, broken house with a dark history, loose floorboards, and stories passed down from one owner to the next. Our house was not old at all. Even now, it is only about 14 years old. It was built on what people would call new ground. I say new ground because most people think a house cannot be haunted unless it is ancient, or unless something terrible happened directly inside it. But that is not always how it works. Sometimes a haunting does not come from the house itself. Sometimes it comes from the land underneath it, from whatever was there before the walls were built, and the rooms were named and families moved in with boxes and furniture and plans for the future. Before our house was built, this had all been wooded land. Trees had stood here. Then the trees were cut down and a subdivision went up in their place. Most people would look at that and assume there could not possibly be anything strange about a brand new neighborhood. They would say, "How can a newer house be haunted?" But I have never believed that the age of a building is what matters most. Sometimes it is the ground. Sometimes it is what was already there, long before any family moved in and called it home. There is one room in our house that has always stood apart from the rest. It is the room above the garage, and officially it is our guest room. For years we joked and called it the grandpa room, though that is really another story. A lot has happened in our family over the last several years. I have lost 3 grandparents, and none of those losses happened without some kind of paranormal event around them. So yes, I have always believed that my grandparents still come through from time to time. Their presence never felt especially dark to me. Strange, yes. Emotional, yes. But not frightening in the deepest sense. If something happened and I felt one of them, I could live with that. They were family. They belonged to me, and I belonged to them. That was never really the problem. The problem was the 4th presence. That one was not my grandparents. That one was different, and I knew it. I had always neglected to talk about that part. Maybe because it was harder to explain. Maybe because it felt less harmless. Maybe because speaking about it out loud would make it too real. But the truth is that I felt this other presence in that room all the time. It did not come and go in the same way my grandparents seemed to. It was just there. Watching. Waiting. Holding on to the room like it considered the room its own. When I left for college, my sister took my old bedroom because that room had its own bathroom attached. That meant that whenever I came home for summer break or winter break, I had to sleep in the guest room above the garage. So the room that already made me uneasy became my room every time I returned home. I could never fully relax there. Even before anything dramatic happened, I always got that uneasy feeling the second I stepped into it. It was not just normal discomfort. It felt like entering a place where something invisible was already aware of me before I even crossed the threshold. I honestly believe that things like this feed off fear. That may sound dramatic, but I came to that conclusion after a lot of thought. I am not someone who jumps too quickly to wild explanations. I am an engineer, and because of that, my instinct is usually to look at things from a logical, practical, almost experimental point of view. I like to observe. I like to test. I like to separate what I actually know from what I only feel. So when I noticed that this presence seemed stronger when I was scared, I began thinking about it almost like a kind of experiment. If there is something in this room, and if it seems to show itself most when fear builds, then what happens if I deliberately let myself become afraid? What happens if I stop fighting the feeling and just let it grow? That was the sort of question I asked myself. Looking back now, I know that was probably not the smartest idea. But at the time, I wanted answers more than I wanted comfort. So I tried it. I sat there in that room and allowed myself to get scared. Not just a little uneasy. I mean really scared. I let the fear rise in me on purpose. I thought about all the nights I could never sleep there. I thought about the feeling of being watched. I thought about how strange the room felt compared to the rest of the upstairs. I let my imagination open wide, and instead of trying to calm myself down, I let the fear build and build and build. And sure enough, just as I had suspected, the room changed. Or maybe I changed and began sensing more sharply what was already there. I do not know. But the feeling came over me quickly after that. The room no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. It felt as if something had stepped closer without actually moving. The sensation of being watched became so strong that it almost felt physical, like pressure in the air. I had never been able to sleep in that room. Not really. I had tried many times, but I always ended up feeling uneasy or restless or flat out afraid. And when I think about it now, there is another detail that seems important. We had 2 dogs that spent a lot of time upstairs. Dogs usually wander wherever they want. They nap in corners, follow people into rooms, and settle down where they feel comfortable. But I realized that I had never once seen either of them go into that guest room. Not once. They would be all over the upstairs, and yet somehow that one room always remained off limits to them, as if they had made up their minds about it long before I had. That night, after letting my fear build up, I finally stood up and turned around. I did not see anything. The room looked empty. But that did not help because the feeling remained. It was still there, steady and close. So, almost out of frustration, I asked the empty room out loud why I could never sleep there. I did not shout. I did not perform some dramatic challenge. I simply asked the question because it was the one that had been sitting in my mind for years. And then I heard a voice answer. It said, "Get out, this is our room." Even now, I cannot fully tell you whether that voice was purely auditory in the normal sense, or whether it came into me in some other way. But I definitely heard it. It was not just a random thought in my own mind. It did not feel self-generated. It felt separate from me, like an answer returning from the room itself. What struck me immediately was the word our. Not my room. Our room. That single word unsettled me more than almost anything else, because it suggested more than one presence, or at least something that did not think of itself as alone. And it was possessive. That room, in whatever way mattered to that thing, belonged to it. The strangest part was that the moment I left the room, everything felt fine again. That happened over and over with that space. Inside it, the tension would build, the fear would gather, the sense of being watched would become unbearable. But the second I stepped out, the feeling would ease. It was almost like crossing an invisible line. For that reason, I usually ended up sleeping in the game room just outside the guest room, usually on the couch. That room never bothered me in the same way. I could rest there, and most of the time I was left alone. Most of the time. There was one night, though, when that changed. I had decided to ignore the presence as much as I could and just sleep on the couch outside the guest room. I was tired, and I did not want to keep letting fear control my whole night. So I laid down in the game room and tried to settle. At first, things seemed normal enough. But after a while, it felt like the presence had decided it was allowed to leave the room. That is the best way I can describe it. I could not see it, but I could feel it in the room with me. It was not just anxiety. It was that same unmistakable sensation of occupied space, of something unseen standing close enough to affect the whole atmosphere around you. The air changes when something like that happens. The room feels smaller, tighter, more aware. And even if you cannot point to one visible shape and say there it is, every part of you knows you are not alone. I could not take it. I got up and went downstairs and slept on the couch there instead, with the TV on. The sound and light made me feel safer. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes if a room is full of familiar human noise, it keeps fear at a distance. I finally started calming down. But then I realized I had not brushed my teeth, or washed my face, or done any of the little things people usually do before bed. That meant I had to go back upstairs, because my things were still in the guest room. I put it off as long as I could. Eventually, I worked up the courage and headed back up the stairs. My heart was already racing a little, but I told myself I was just being ridiculous. It was my house. It was just a room. I went up, one step at a time, and when I reached the top of the stairs, I came face to face with it. That was the moment I finally saw it clearly. And I saw it for about 2 full seconds, which is long enough to know what you saw. I have replayed that moment so many times in my mind that it is burned into me. For years I barely spoke about it because I did not know how to explain it without sounding insane. But the truth is, I definitely saw something. It was definitely there. It was not a blur or a vague impression or a trick of the light. I got a clear look at it. The thing was like a shadow, but not like a flat shadow cast on a wall. It was three-dimensional. It had depth. It occupied space. It was dark in the deepest way, the kind of blackness that is not just the absence of light but seems like a substance in itself. It was about 5 feet tall, maybe about a foot shorter than me based on how I remember standing next to it. And I was very close to it. Maybe a foot away. That closeness matters because it means I was not seeing some distant shape at the far end of the room. It was right there, near enough that I could make out its form in detail before it moved. It flew past me incredibly fast, so fast that by the time my body fully reacted it was already gone. But in that split second I still got a good look at it. My first thought was that it looked like a monk. That may sound strange, but that is honestly what came to mind. It did not have a modern human shape in the ordinary sense. It seemed to be wearing some kind of cloak with a hood. The cloak looked large, flowing, wavy, almost like fabric caught in motion. It had ragged or trailing pieces behind it, which made it look even stranger, almost worn or torn by time itself. I do not remember clearly whether I saw arms. If it had them, they did not stand out. What stood out was the shape of the hood, the heaviness of the cloak, and the sense that the whole thing was trying not to be fully seen. That was one of the strangest feelings I got from it. It was looking downward, and the impression I received was that it did not want me to notice it directly. It felt like something meant to remain half-hidden, like a background presence, something that preferred to be sensed rather than observed face to face. That sounds impossible to explain, but that is exactly how it felt. Looking at it, I got the impression that it wanted to exist in the corner of awareness, not in the center of vision. It was moving in the opposite direction from me. I was coming up the stairs, and when I reached the top, it ran around me in a curve, carefully enough that it did not touch me, and then rushed down the stairs. That was another detail that stayed with me. It did not go through me. It moved around me. That made it feel even more real somehow, because it reacted to my physical presence and adjusted its path. It was just like a shadow, yes, but a three-dimensional one, something with volume and movement and purpose. For a long time after that, I told myself it must have been a hallucination. That seemed easier than dealing with what it really was. If something like that happens to you, the mind wants desperately to protect itself with explanations. Maybe I was tired. Maybe fear had already primed me to see something. Maybe the dark hallway and the top of the stairs created a visual trick. I tried to tell myself all of that. But those explanations did not sit right, because the thing I saw had too much structure, too much detail, too much intention in the way it moved. Eventually, I decided to do some research. I looked up shadow people on Google. I had heard the phrase before in passing, but I had never paid much attention to it because I was not the type of person who wanted to collect ghost labels for everything I experienced. But this time I needed to know whether anyone else had ever seen anything remotely like what I had seen. That was when it got even stranger. I came across a page about shadow people, and on one site there were 2 pictures. In the second picture there were 2 sketches, and the figure on the right was exactly what I had seen. Exactly? I still remember the shock of that moment. It was not close. It was not vaguely similar. It was the same thing. The same hooded, cloaked, shadow-like form. I could not have asked for a better image of what I had seen in my own house. The only difference was that I do not remember seeing eyes. But that makes sense too because the thing was not trying to look at me. It was looking down, trying to remain unnoticed even while moving past me. When I saw that picture, I knew I had not imagined it. Or at least, if I had imagined it, then somehow I had imagined the exact same rare figure other people had already sketched and described. That felt much less likely than simply accepting that shadow people are real, at least real enough that people can see the same forms in different places and know what they saw. The guest room above the garage never felt normal to me after that. Not that it had before, but after seeing that thing with my own eyes, all doubt about the room being different disappeared. I stopped thinking in vague terms like weird energy or bad feeling. The room had a presence. Maybe more than one, given what the voice had said. and whatever was there did not want me in it. That was clear. What stayed with me almost as much as the sighting itself was the pattern around the room. The dogs never went in there. The fear would build quickly when I stayed in there too long. The room felt watched, occupied, claimed. And when I asked why I could not sleep there, I got an answer. An answer that was hostile but also strangely calm, as if the rule had already been set long before I arrived. "Get out, this is our room." That line has lived in my head ever since. It makes me think sometimes that perhaps the room had never truly been ours, no matter whose furniture was in it, no matter who slept there when family visited. Maybe some places are simply shared in ways the living do not recognize until something decides to speak up. What troubles me too is that fear really did seem to strengthen whatever was there. I hate admitting that because it sounds like feeding a nightmare, but I believe it. The more afraid I became, the more the room seemed to respond. That is why I did that experiment in the first place, and the results convinced me more than I expected. Fear sharpened the presence. It was as if the room grew fuller, thicker, more aware when I gave it that energy. That is a dangerous thing to realize. Because once you know that, you start becoming afraid of your own fear. You stop trusting your reactions because every spike of terror feels like it might be making things stronger. It becomes a kind of loop. The room scares you, your fear rises, the presence feels stronger, then you grow more frightened. That was exactly why I preferred the couch outside the room or downstairs with the TV on. Distance broke the cycle. And yet, even outside the room, it found ways to remind me it was there. That one night on the couch in the game room proved that. I had tried to keep a respectful distance. I had stayed out of the room. But it still felt like the presence stepped beyond its usual boundaries and entered the space I was trying to claim as safe. That is what pushed me downstairs that night. And then, when I forced myself to go back up, I paid for it by finally seeing the thing itself. I often wonder what it would have done if I had not been coming up the stairs at that exact moment. Would it have kept moving through the upstairs unseen? Would it have slipped back into the guest room unnoticed? Was I never supposed to see it directly, and that is why it moved so fast when it realized I was there? I do not know. But I do know that the moment we crossed paths, I got the distinct sense that it disliked being seen. Not because it turned toward me in anger, but because everything about it seemed designed to exist at the edge of awareness. It did not want attention. It wanted presence without recognition. That, in some ways, makes it even creepier. A thing that wants to be hidden is harder to fight than a thing that makes itself obvious. Sometimes I think about the word shadow and realize it is too weak for what I saw. A shadow is flat. It depends on light and object and angle. What I saw was its own form. It was dark like a shadow, yes, but it was independent of any surface. It moved with depth. It had shape. It had intention. It was not caused by something else. It was something else. For years, I kept most of this to myself. Partly because it is hard to talk about these things without people deciding you are either lying, exaggerating, or mentally unwell. And partly because saying it out loud makes it feel closer again. But when I finally read about shadow people and saw that picture, it gave me enough confidence to admit that what I experienced was not just some private terror with no name. Other people had seen similar things. Other people had tried to sketch them. Other people knew that same impossible dark form. That did not make it less frightening, but it made it less lonely. The room is still one of the clearest examples in my life of a space that did not belong entirely to the living. And the fact that it was in a relatively new house matters to me, because people are so quick to assume that only old houses can hold old things. But land has memory too. Land holds what stood on it before, what happened on it before, and what moved through it before the roads were paved and the houses were framed and the families moved in thinking they were making something fresh and untouched. I have never believed our house was untouched. Not truly. Maybe that guest room simply sat in the wrong place. Or maybe it sat in exactly the right place for something that had already been there long before us. Whatever the explanation, I know what I saw at the top of those stairs. A dark, cloaked, monk-like shadow with depth and motion, moving around me with terrifying speed, trying not to be directly noticed, yet real enough to burn itself into my memory forever. And once you have seen something like that, it becomes impossible to go back to believing that shadows are always empty. One afternoon, I was driving home from a doctor's appointment. It was around noon, and the day had that cold, gray feeling that sometimes comes in Texas when the weather decides to remind everyone that winter does exist. It was not freezing in the way northern places freeze, but it was cold enough that anyone with sense would have worn a jacket. I remember this detail clearly because it made what happened next look even stranger. I turned the corner onto my street and pulled into the driveway of my house. As I was parking, I happened to glance across the street toward the house on the corner, where one of my teenage neighbors lived. The boy was around 15 or 16, and for my own private amusement I called him SK8 Turboy. That was not his real name, of course, but it fit him. He was always out in the street on his skateboard, trying tricks and acting like the whole neighborhood was his stage. Sometimes he would come flying out so recklessly that I used to joke to myself that he was daring me to run him over. Up to that point, I had managed to resist the temptation. Now this was not the kind of kid you would usually feel sorry for at first sight. He carried himself like he thought he was the toughest thing on two legs. He acted hard. He talked hard. He liked looking wild and fearless. He was the type of boy who thought being loud, rude, and impossible to manage made him seem important. So when I saw him that day burst out of his front door and run full speed like his life depended on it, I did not immediately think fear. I thought chaos. I thought drama. I thought maybe he had finally done something stupid enough to bring real trouble down on his own head. But then I really looked at him. He came shooting out of his house so fast that he did not even seem to know exactly where he was going. He just ran. He ran straight across his yard and practically launched himself into the rose bushes planted across the street in front of the neighbor's house. Not a stumble. Not a careful crouch. A full dive. It would have been funny under almost any other circumstance, and honestly, I will tell the truth, I did laugh. I laughed because it was ridiculous. Here was this self-proclaimed little gangster flying into a thorn bush like a scared rabbit. He was wearing only a pair of ripped-up blue jeans. No shirt. No shoes. Barefoot on a cold day, running out of his house like the devil himself had come through the front door after him. That alone told me something was very wrong. No teenage boy who cared that much about looking cool would choose to go flying into winter air half naked unless he was completely panicked. I stayed in the car for a moment, and watched him fight his way out of the rose bush. He had gotten himself tangled pretty good. There were branches catching on his jeans, and from the way he was moving, I could tell the thorns had gotten him. He finally untangled himself and stood there catching his breath, looking like he had just run a marathon and lost. I was still half laughing, but then I noticed he was walking toward me. That got my attention. I started to get out of my car, and by then he was close enough for me to see his face properly. He was pale. Really pale. Not fake pale. Not the kind of pale you get from trying to act scared for attention. His face had gone almost gray under the skin. His eyes were wide too, but not in the wild, glassy way of someone high or crazy. I made a point to check that. He had a bit of a reputation already. He was known around the neighborhood as a small-time drug dealer, or at least he liked people to think he was. I looked straight into his eyes to see if his pupils were blown, or if he was out of his head on something. They were not. He looked scared, not stoned. He had scratches all across his chest from diving into the rose bushes. Thin red lines were starting to stand out against his skin, and that made the whole scene even more unreal. A few minutes earlier, I had simply been coming home from a doctor's appointment. Now I was standing in my driveway staring at a half-naked teenage boy covered in thorn scratches and looking like he had seen something that had drained every bit of swagger out of him. I asked him if he was okay. He stood there breathing hard for another second and then said, "Well, it's a long story, but my house is haunted." He paused after saying that and looked at me carefully, like he was waiting for me to laugh in his face. I probably would have, under other circumstances. But something about the way he said it, and the way he looked, made me hold back. Instead of laughing, I just kind of motioned for him to keep going. Then he told me that he had been alone in the house when he heard something beating on the walls of the garage. Not knocking. Not tapping. Beating. And then, according to him, whatever it was started screaming at him, and calling his name. He said it like he still could not believe he was repeating the words out loud. He finished by saying, "I'm home alone, and I'll be damned if I'm going into the house again alone." Now, I need to explain something about this kid. This boy thought he was bad. Not just a little rough around the edges, but full-on convinced he was some kind of neighborhood gangster. I had heard him, more than once, screaming at his mother from across the street with language that would have made a sailor proud. He cursed at that woman like she was his enemy, and not the person raising him. The police were no strangers to that address either. Their house had enough drama attached to it that the whole street knew their business whether we wanted to or not. And as for me, I was not exactly his biggest fan. If he had been my child, I would have put a stop to his behavior a long time before it got that far. But his mother put up with it, maybe out of love, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe because she did not know what else to do. That was part of what made the moment so surreal. This was the same boy who strutted around like nothing on earth could touch him. The same one who acted like he feared nobody. And here he was, standing in my driveway, pale, barefoot, scratched up, and asking for help because something inside his own house had scared him so badly he would rather sit outside in the cold than go back in. Then he asked to use my phone to call his mother. Now, I was not about to invite him into my house. I did not trust him, and I was home alone. There was no chance I was going to hand him access to my home phone. But the way he asked for his mother changed something in the whole scene. It did not make him look tough or dramatic anymore. It made him look young. It made him look like a scared kid who wanted his mama to come save him. So even though I still did not like him, I handed him my cell phone. I figured that if he decided to run off with it, the phone was insured and I would get a new one. That was the practical side of me taking precautions, while the softer side of me admitted he clearly needed help. He did not run. He took the phone and called his mother. Or rather, he tried to. He got her voicemail again and again, and each time he left another increasingly pitiful message begging her to come home right away. Hearing him do that was almost more unsettling than the story he had told me. It is one thing to hear a teenager say something creepy scared him. It is another to hear a boy who usually acts like a little criminal suddenly sound like a frightened child because whatever happened had stripped all the attitude right out of him. His voice cracked. He sounded desperate. He kept saying she needed to come home now. By then the cold had started getting into me too. I had been standing outside longer than I expected, and I really wanted to go inside my house and shut the door behind me. So I asked him what he was going to do if she did not answer right away. He just looked at me and said, "I guess I'm going to sit in the driveway until Mom comes home." Then he thanked me. That part stunned me almost more than anything else. He thanked me politely, handed my phone back, and walked across the street. He went to the very edge of his driveway and sat down in a tight little ball, huddled up against the cold. It was such a pathetic sight compared to the boy's usual swagger that for a second I just stood there holding my phone and staring after him. I think part of me was still trying to fit this version of him together with the one I normally saw skating around the street and cussing people out. I finally went into my house, but I did not stop watching entirely. Every few minutes I peeked out the window to see if he was still sitting there. He was. He sat there for about 10 minutes, just waiting, folded up into himself and staring at nothing. I was concerned, yes, though I will admit I was also still a little wary. I was home alone, and as pitiful as he looked, he was still a boy I did not fully trust. So I watched from inside. I told myself the cold would not kill him for that short amount of time. He had made his choice, and clearly it felt safer to him than going back into the house. Then his mother finally drove up. The second her car pulled into the driveway, he got up and went to her. They did not stand around outside talking long. They both headed inside together, and whatever happened after that, I did not see. Unfortunately, I had to leave for work not long after, so I never got the chance that day to walk over and ask his mother what exactly he had told her or whether she found anything in the house. And let me tell you, I wanted to talk to his mama. I really wanted to know if she had heard anything strange in that house before. I wanted to know whether she believed him or brushed him off. I wanted to know if the younger siblings had seen or heard anything. I wanted to know if there had been banging and screaming more than once, or if that day had been the first. There were so many questions in my mind, and none of them got answered because life moved on and I had to go to work. Still, the whole thing stuck with me. I kept replaying it in my head afterward. The way he came out of that house. The way he launched himself into the rose bushes like he had no idea what he was doing except that he had to get away. The scratches on his chest. The look in his eyes. The change in his voice when he asked for his mother. All of it felt too real to be made up on the spot. This was not some prank or some silly attempt to get attention. If he had wanted attention in the way he usually did, he would have strutted over and told the story like he thought it made him look cool. But he did not. He looked ashamed of how scared he was, which made me believe him more. And I will admit something else too. Part of me enjoyed the irony. Here was this kid who had spent so much time trying to look tough in front of everybody, and whatever was in that house had apparently knocked that right out of him. I should not say it, but I will, because it is the truth. A little piece of me thought maybe it served him right. Not because I wanted him harmed, but because he had made such a habit of tormenting other people, especially his mother. Seeing him finally afraid of something bigger than himself felt almost like watching the universe step in and do what nobody else had managed to do. Now I know this next part is only my own theory. I cannot prove it. But I have always felt that whatever was in that house did not like the way he treated his family. I think that boy was so mean to his mother and his younger brothers or sisters, and so full of himself, that whatever was in that place had taken a special interest in reminding him that he was not as hard as he thought he was. Maybe that sounds strange. Maybe it sounds like I am assigning moral judgment to a haunting. But there was something about the whole thing that made me feel that whatever was there was not just randomly making noise. It seemed to go after him when he was alone. It scared him in a way meant to take him down a few levels. Maybe it was trying to humble him. Maybe it was trying to warn him. Maybe it just liked tormenting the loudest person in the house. I do not know. But I still remember the way he said those words. My house is haunted. Not with bravado. Not as a joke. But as a confession from somebody who had just found out there are some things you cannot threaten, curse at, or act tough around. And honestly, if something really was in that house, I cannot help thinking it chose its target very carefully. Because a boy like that needed to be scared at least once in his life.